I stared at my phone screen, reading the text message for the third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Hey honey, I know this is last minute, but we're going to keep Thanksgiving small this year. Just immediate family. Maybe next year? My mother's words felt like a punch to the gut, each letter burning into my retinas as I sat in my cramped studio apartment in Medford. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was immediate family, wasn't I? I'd been coming to Thanksgiving dinner at Mom's house for 28 years, ever since I could hold a fork properly. The tradition was as sacred to me as breathing, and now she was telling me to skip it like it was some casual dinner party. My hands trembled as I set the phone down on my kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd been preparing my famous green bean casserole just an hour earlier. The smell of caramelized onions still lingered in the air, mocking me now with its warmth and comfort. I'd spent $40 I couldn't really afford on organic ingredients, wanting to contribute something special to our family gathering. The casserole dish sat there, perfectly assembled and ready to travel, like a monument to my naivety. How could I have been so stupid to assume I'd be welcome at my own family's table? The question echoed in my mind as I stared at the dish, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Something about Mom's message felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The phrasing was too careful, too rehearsed, like she'd practiced it several times before hitting send. Just immediate family. What did that even mean? Last I checked, I was her daughter, born and raised in this very town, with the same last name and the same stubborn chin that ran in our family. But as I thought about it more, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I knew exactly who would be at that table tomorrow, and it wasn't just immediate family. It would be my sister Sarah, her husband Brian, and their perfect little life that seemed to sparkle with success wherever they went. The comparison between Sarah and me had been a constant undercurrent in our family for as long as I could remember, but it had gotten worse since she married Brian 3 years ago. He was everything our mother had probably dreamed of in a son-in-law, successful, charming, and wealthy enough to shower our family with expensive gifts at every holiday. Meanwhile, I was still working 2 part-time jobs just to make rent on my tiny apartment, driving a car that made concerning noises every time I started it. I'd always told myself that Mom loved us equally, that the differences in our lives didn't matter to her. But sitting there in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my modest existence, I couldn't ignore the truth that had been staring me in the face for years. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through our family group chat, looking for any clues about what was really happening. The last message was from Sarah 2 days ago, talking about bringing something special for dessert and asking if Mom needed help with anything. There was no mention of keeping things small, no discussion about limiting the guest list. In fact, the conversation seemed to suggest the opposite, that this would be a big, elaborate celebration, like always. My chest tightened as I realized that the decision to exclude me had been made without any input from the group chat, probably in private conversations that I wasn't part of. The feeling of being deliberately left out was worse than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. As the evening wore on, I found myself pacing around my apartment like a caged animal, unable to focus on anything except the growing hurt in my chest. I tried to rationalize Mom's decision, to find some logical explanation that didn't involve favoritism or rejection. Maybe she really was trying to keep things small this year. Maybe there had been some miscommunication. Maybe she was planning to call me later with a different explanation. But deep down, I knew I was grasping at straws, desperately trying to protect myself from a truth that was becoming increasingly obvious. The golden child was coming to dinner, and there wasn't room for the disappointment at the table. I thought about calling Mom directly, demanding an explanation, but something held me back. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to beg for an invitation to my own family's Thanksgiving dinner. But there was something else too, a growing suspicion that there was more to this story than Mom was telling me. The timing felt deliberate, the exclusion too clean and calculated. If I pushed too hard now, I might never find out what was really going on. Instead, I decided to wait and watch to see how this played out. Sometimes the truth reveals itself when people think no one is paying attention, and I had a feeling that tomorrow would be very revealing indeed. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions and hurt feelings that wouldn't let me sleep. The green bean casserole sat in my refrigerator like a symbol of everything that was wrong with this situation, prepared with love, unwanted, and slowly going cold. I'd always prided myself on being the family member who showed up, who remembered birthdays, and brought thoughtful gifts even when money was tight. But apparently, showing up wasn't enough anymore. Apparently, being family wasn't enough either. As I finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of Thanksgiving morning, I made a promise to myself that I would find out exactly why I'd been cast aside, no matter how much the truth might hurt. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood perfectly as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and absolutely nowhere to go. The irony of having a completely free Thanksgiving for the first time in my adult life wasn't lost on me. I could sleep in, watch movies, order Chinese food, do whatever I wanted. But all I wanted was to be sitting around Mom's dining room table, arguing with Sarah about politics, while Brian tried to change the subject and Mom fussed over whether the turkey was too dry. Instead, I was staring out my window at the empty parking lot of my apartment complex, watching other people drive off to their family gatherings while I remained conspicuously alone. Around noon, I made the mistake of checking social media, something I'd promised myself I wouldn't do, but couldn't resist. The first thing that popped up was a photo from my cousin Jenny, who lived across town and had apparently been invited to Mom's house despite not being immediate family. She'd posted a picture of herself getting ready with the caption, "So excited for Aunt Linda's famous Thanksgiving spread." The image showed her in a beautiful new dress, clearly preparing for something much more elaborate than the small, intimate gathering Mom had described to me. My stomach dropped as I realized that not only had I been excluded, but the explanation I'd been given was a complete lie. I spent the next hour scrolling through social media like a masochist, watching as more and more photos appeared from what was clearly a large, festive gathering at my mother's house. There was my Uncle Tom carving the turkey, my cousin Mark playing football in the backyard with Brian, and Sarah looking radiant in what appeared to be a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The table was set for at least 12 people, decorated with expensive-looking centerpieces and what appeared to be new china that I'd never seen before. Every photo was a knife to my heart, evidence that I'd been deliberately excluded from what looked like the most elaborate Thanksgiving our family had ever hosted. The worst part was seeing how happy everyone looked without me there. I'd always thought of myself as an integral part of our family gatherings, the one who helped Mom in the kitchen and kept the conversation flowing when things got awkward. But looking at these photos, it was clear that my absence hadn't left any kind of void. If anything, the celebration looked more polished and sophisticated without me there, like they'd upgraded to a better version of our family that didn't include the struggling daughter who couldn't afford to contribute much beyond a homemade casserole. The realization that I was expendable hit me harder than I'd expected, leaving me feeling hollow and worthless. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see this for myself, to understand what was really happening at my mother's house. I threw on a jacket and drove the familiar route to Mom's neighborhood, telling myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head. But I knew exactly where I was headed, and when I turned onto her street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. The driveway was packed with cars, not just Sarah and Brian's luxury SUV, but vehicles I recognized belonging to extended family members who supposedly hadn't been invited to this small gathering. The house was lit up like a Christmas display, with warm light spilling from every window and the sound of laughter carrying across the yard. I parked across the street and sat in my car like some kind of stalker, watching my own family celebrate without me. Through the large front window, I could see people moving around the living room, drinks in hand, clearly having the time of their lives. At one point, I saw Brian standing near the fireplace, gesturing animatedly while a group of relatives hung on his every word. He was wearing what looked like an expensive sweater, and even from a distance, I could see the way everyone seemed drawn to him, like he was the star of the show. It was a scene I'd witnessed before, but never from the outside looking in. Never as the person who wasn't welcome at her own family's table. As I sat there watching, a terrible thought began to form in my mind. This wasn't just about keeping things small or intimate. This was about image. With Brian there, with his success and his money and his ability to elevate any gathering just by his presence, maybe Mom had decided that I didn't fit the picture she wanted to present. Maybe my secondhand clothes and my beat-up car and my obvious financial struggles were an embarrassment she didn't want to deal with in front of her golden son-in-law. The thought made me feel sick, but it also made a horrible kind of sense. I'd always known that Sarah was the favorite, but I'd never imagined that my own mother would be ashamed of me. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd witnessed. The elaborate celebration, the expensive decorations, the guest list that included everyone except me. It all painted a picture that I didn't want to accept but couldn't ignore. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine and wait for next year's invitation, like a good little daughter. I was going to find out exactly what was going on in my family, and I was going to get the answers I deserved, no matter how uncomfortable those answers might be for everyone involved. The next morning, I woke up with a determination I hadn't felt in years, fueled by a mixture of hurt and righteous anger that had been simmering all night. I'd spent hours lying awake, replaying every family interaction from the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. There had been subtle changes, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, private phone calls that Mom would take in another room, and an increasing number of family decisions that seemed to be made without my input. I'd attributed it all to my own paranoia, but now I was beginning to see a pattern that I'd been too naive or too hopeful to recognize before. I decided to start my investigation with the most obvious source: social media. If my family was going to document their elaborate celebration online, they might inadvertently reveal more than they intended. I spent the morning going through every photo and comment from yesterday's gathering, screenshotting everything and looking for details that might give me insight into what was really happening. What I found was even more disturbing than I'd expected. The photos showed not just an expensive meal, but expensive everything. New furniture in Mom's living room, professional quality decorations, and gifts that looked like they came from high-end stores rather than the modest department stores our family usually shopped at. One photo in particular caught my attention. A shot of the dining room table that showed place settings with what appeared to be brand new china and crystal glasses. I'd been to enough family dinners to know that Mom's usual dishes were the same mismatched set she'd been using for 20 years, inherited from my grandmother and supplemented with pieces from various garage sales. This was something entirely different, something that spoke of money and taste that my mother had never had access to before. The more I studied the photos, the more questions arose about where all this newfound luxury was coming from. I decided to take a more direct approach and called my cousin Jenny, the one who'd posted about being excited for Aunt Linda's famous Thanksgiving spread. Jenny had always been chatty and not particularly good at keeping secrets, so I figured she might let something slip if I approached the conversation carefully. When she answered, she sounded slightly uncomfortable, like she'd been expecting my call and dreading it. "Oh, Nicole," she said, her voice artificially bright. "How was your Thanksgiving? Did you do something special?" The fact that she was pretending not to know I'd been excluded told me everything I needed to know about how much the family had discussed my absence. I played along with her charade for a few minutes, making small talk about my quiet holiday while fishing for information about the gathering I'd missed. Jenny was clearly trying to avoid giving me details, but her natural tendency to overshare eventually won out. She mentioned how generous Brian had been, how he'd insisted on bringing not just wine, but an entire case of expensive champagne, and how he'd surprised Mom with the most beautiful flower arrangements she'd ever seen. The way Jenny talked about Brian, it was like he was some kind of benevolent prince who'd descended upon our humble family to shower us with gifts and sophistication. But it was what Jenny said next that really got my attention. "Your mom was so relieved that everything went perfectly," she said, then immediately seemed to realize she'd said too much. When I pressed her on what Mom had been worried about, Jenny backtracked quickly, claiming she just meant that hosting a big dinner was always stressful. But the damage was done. She'd revealed that Mom had been specifically concerned about something going wrong, something that my presence might have jeopardized. The implication was clear. I was seen as a potential problem, a wild card that might disrupt the perfect image my family was trying to present. After I hung up with Jenny, I sat in my apartment feeling like I was putting together pieces of a puzzle that revealed an ugly picture I didn't want to see. My family hadn't just excluded me from Thanksgiving. They'd actively conspired to create a version of our family that didn't include me, a version that was more palatable to Brian and his wealthy sensibilities. The expensive decorations, the upgraded everything, the careful guest list that included extended family, but not the daughter who might remind everyone of our more modest roots. It all pointed to a level of calculation that made my stomach turn. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I was going to confront Mom directly, but not in the way she'd expect. Instead of calling or showing up at her house emotional and demanding answers, I was going to do some more digging first. I was going to find out exactly how deep this deception went, and I was going to arm myself with facts before I walked into what was sure to be a difficult conversation. If my family thought they could rewrite our history to exclude me, they were about to learn that I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I was going to fight for my place at the table, even if it meant exposing truths that everyone would prefer to keep hidden. My investigation took an unexpected turn when I decided to drive by Mom's house again. This time during the day when I could get a better look at all the changes I'd glimpsed in the social media photos. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a landscaping crew working in the front yard, installing what looked like expensive new plants and decorative stones. This wasn't the kind of home improvement project my mother could afford on her fixed income, and it certainly wasn't something she would have undertaken without mentioning it to me. I'd been helping her with yard work for years, and she'd always complained about not having the money for anything beyond basic maintenance. I parked down the street and watched as the workers continued their transformation of Mom's modest front yard into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The crew was clearly professional, with matching uniforms and expensive equipment, not the kind of budget operation my mother would typically hire. As I sat there, a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. What if this wasn't just about excluding me from one dinner? What if there was something much bigger going on, something that explained not just my absence from Thanksgiving, but all the subtle changes I'd been noticing in my family's behavior over the past few months? That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I drove to Sarah and Brian's neighborhood to see if I could learn anything from observing their lifestyle. They lived in an upscale development about 20 minutes from Mom's house, in an area I rarely visited because it made me feel inadequate about my own living situation. But as I drove through their neighborhood, looking at the perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars in every driveway, I started to understand something about the world Brian came from and the standards he was probably used to. Our family gatherings, with their potluck dishes and mismatched furniture, must have seemed incredibly humble to someone accustomed to this level of luxury. When I reached their house, I was struck by how different it looked from the last time I'd visited. The landscaping was even more elaborate than what was being installed at Mom's house, and there were several new additions that spoke of serious money. A 3-car garage that hadn't been there before, professional outdoor lighting, and what appeared to be a completely renovated front entrance. Either Brian's business was doing incredibly well, or there was more money flowing through this family than I'd realized. The sight of their obvious prosperity made my own financial struggles feel even more acute, and I began to understand why my presence might be seen as an uncomfortable reminder of a different economic reality. As I was preparing to leave, I saw something that stopped me cold. Brian's car was pulling into the driveway, but he wasn't alone. Mom was in the passenger seat, and they appeared to be returning from some kind of shopping trip. I watched from a distance as they unloaded several bags from what looked like expensive stores, laughing and talking like old friends. The easy familiarity between them was something I'd never witnessed before, and it suggested a relationship that went far beyond the typical mother-in-law and son-in-law dynamic. They looked like conspirators, like people who shared secrets and made plans together. I followed them at a distance as Brian drove Mom back to her house, my mind racing with questions about what I'd just witnessed. When they arrived, I watched as Brian helped carry the shopping bags inside, staying for what appeared to be a lengthy visit. Through the windows, I could see them moving around the house together, and at one point, Brian seemed to be examining something in the living room, pointing and gesturing like he was giving advice or making suggestions. The scene looked disturbingly domestic, like Brian had become more of a son to my mother than I was a daughter. When Brian finally left and Mom's house was quiet again, I sat in my car trying to process what I'd seen. The shopping trip, the easy familiarity, the way they'd moved through her house like they were planning something together. It all pointed to a relationship that had developed far beyond what I'd been aware of. But more than that, It suggested that the money for all these home improvements and expensive dinners wasn't just coming from Brian's generosity at holidays. It looked like he was actively involved in financing my mother's lifestyle, which would explain why my presence at family gatherings had become problematic. I wasn't just the poor daughter anymore. I was a threat to a carefully constructed arrangement that depended on maintaining certain appearances. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront Mom the next day, but I wasn't going to go in blind. I was going to ask her directly about her relationship with Brian, about the money that was clearly flowing into her household, and about why I'd been excluded from the family I'd thought I belonged to. I was tired of being treated like a problem to be managed, tired of being excluded from decisions that affected my own family. If there were secrets being kept, if there were arrangements being made that impacted my place in this family, I had a right to know about them. The truth was going to come out, whether my family was ready for it or not. The next morning, I drove to Mom's house with my heart pounding and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, but with a resolve I'd never felt before. I'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in my head, but I knew that no amount of preparation could ready me for what I was about to discover. When Mom opened the door, her face immediately showed guilt and surprise, like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. "Nicole, honey, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice artificially bright in that way that told me she was already preparing to lie to me again. I looked past her into the living room and saw the evidence of Brian's influence everywhere. New furniture, expensive decorations, and a general air of prosperity that my mother had never been able to afford on her own. The transformation was so complete that it felt like I was walking into a stranger's house. "We need to talk, Mom," I said, pushing past her into the living room where I could see the full extent of the changes that had been made. "I know about Brian paying for all of this. I know about the shopping trips, the landscaping, the expensive dinners. I know you've been lying to me about why I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving." Mom's face went white as she realized that her carefully constructed deception was falling apart, and for a moment, she looked older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But then something shifted in her expression, and I saw a hardness there that I'd never noticed before, a calculating look that told me she'd been prepared for this conversation even if she'd hoped it would never come. "You don't understand the situation, Nicole," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge that immediately put me on guard. "Then explain it to me," I demanded, my voice stronger than I'd expected it to be. "Explain why my own mother is ashamed of me. Explain why you've been taking money from Brian and excluding me from family gatherings so I won't embarrass you in front of your wealthy son-in-law." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I watched as Mom's carefully maintained facade finally cracked completely. "It's not about shame," she said, but her voice was shaking now, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "It's about survival, Nicole. Brian isn't just helping with a few expenses. He's keeping me from losing this house. The mortgage payments, the utilities, the medical bills from when I was sick last year, I couldn't afford any of it without his help. And yes, that means I have to be careful about maintaining certain standards when he's around." The truth hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly everything made horrible sense. The expensive upgrades, the careful guest lists, the way my family had been walking on eggshells around Brian for months. My mother wasn't just taking his money, she was completely dependent on it, and my presence at family gatherings was seen as a risk to that financial lifeline. "So, you sold me out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You chose his money over your own daughter." Mom's tears were flowing freely now, but there was still that hardness in her eyes, that calculation that told me she'd made peace with her choice long ago. "I chose to keep my home," she said. "I chose to not be a burden on my children. And yes, that meant making some difficult decisions about how to present our family to someone who has the power to change all our lives." As I stood there in her transformed living room, surrounded by the evidence of Brian's generosity and my own exclusion, I realized that I'd lost more than just a Thanksgiving dinner. I'd lost my place in a family that had decided I was expendable.